Today we're going to talk about how you can transform your learning segments that you have worked on in Module 1 and Module 2 to include some academic language. And we're going to talk through what academic language means and what that looks like, and then we're going to look at what you need to have for your Module 3 major assignment, so that when you come to your conference and talk about your learning segment and how academic language plays into it, you'll be ready to talk through your ideas, ask questions, and so on. So the first thing is that academic language is not academic vocabulary. Those two terms are not interchangeable. Sometimes we mistake that, and I don't want you to mistake that, because academic vocabulary is the vocabulary of your content, and it's very important, but academic language encompasses much more than just vocabulary. It's a larger umbrella, as you'll see here, and it includes these 4 terms. It does include vocabulary. It's absolutely a part of it. But it also includes function, syntax, and discourse. And those may be some new terms to you, especially in regards to how language is used in lesson planning and in teaching. So we're going to talk through each of those parts of academic language that are under the full umbrella of academic language. So what are all of these 4 aspects of academic language? And I have put some key words here in red that I want to stand out to you. So it's the language of the discipline. So this is about your content, and it's language that your students need to learn and use. And use is such a key word, because we want them to use the language, not just memorize it and write it down for a weekly test. It also is used to participate and engage with the content. So again, we're not just memorizing facts in our content. We are having our students engage with our content, interact with our content, and they're going to do that through their academic language. It's oral and written language, and it helps them really express what they understand about your content. So that's what those 4 areas of academic language do, are these aspects, again, about your content area. So why do we need it? Why is it so important? Well, first of all, students need to know what they're being asked to do, but they need to be able to have something to say about your content. And if they don't have the words to say it, then they need some other representational structure to say it. So that may be a table or a chart. That may be chord progressions and music. That can look a lot of different ways for each different content area, but they need to be able to express how they understand the content. And that's really important. And academic language helps them do that. So if you go to the Module 3 major assignment, and you can pause here if you want to skip over and pull that up on D2L, and what you'll find is a template for that assignment in Module 3. And in that template, you're going to, at the top, you're going to start filling out a chart that looks like the one that's on your screen. Now, you also have this chart on the lesson plan that you worked on for Module 1 and 2, so you may be familiar with seeing it because you saw it when you were working on your learning segment. And this is where we're going to start, is filling this out. So we're going to break down each of these parts of academic language. We're going to start with function. So remember, academic language is that umbrella, And the 4 different parts of it are listed underneath, and we're going to start with function. And function is really all about purpose. It's what's the purpose of your learning segment. Now, function does cover your whole learning segment. So you're going to start to look at the verbs that are in your TEKS, that are in your objectives, and you're going to think about what is my function? What's my purpose for the whole 3 to 5 days? Because just a reminder, that learning segment covers 3 to 5 days, and then you wrote an individual lesson plan about one of those days. But for the function, I want you to think about all 3 to 5 days and which one of these functions really captures the focus of what your students are doing. Now, I've given you a list to choose from, and I think that is the easiest way to go about it at first. If you look at this and we just can't find one on this list, then we will talk and discuss an option for a function that is not on this list. But if at all possible, let's stick to this list. And remember, you're only picking one function for the whole learning segment, not a function for each lesson day, for the whole learning segment. So go back to those verbs, look at those verbs and think about what do they connect back to here and what is my focus. So here's some ways you can start to look. You can look and see, am I doing some of these things? Remember, look at those verbs and see what are you doing in your learning segment, and that's going to help you figure out which one of these functions is best suited for your learning segment. So when you go to fill in your chart, you'll see right up there where it says function, and this is where you're going to write one function for that list that I provided you. So what does it look like when you turn it in, and how will it be graded? Well, first of all, you need to list the function, but then in that box. So I'm talking about this box right here. So you're going to list the function, and that's one of those words that's on that list. And then you're going to give some detail about how that function works in your learning segment. So how does this connect to your learning segment? And you'll see in the grading rubric the different levels and points you receive from your description. So it doesn't have to be a really lengthy description, but you do need to list the function and then say, here's how it's going to be used, and here's how it connects to my lesson. So if you say my function is describe, and I'm going to be using it in this way throughout the lessons, and you're showing how it's connected to your learning segment and not just one day, one lesson, then that's how you get to those full points. Next is vocabulary. So vocabulary is something that I want you to consider, this idea of teaching it to students as owning the vocabulary instead of renting the vocabulary. You know, when we own something, it's ours. We can do what we want with it. We have it for a long time. We can change it up. We can really make it our own. When we rent something, we usually have it for a short time. It's not ever our own, and we rarely can make modifications to it. And so you want vocabulary taught to your students where they can own that vocabulary. They can use it. They can apply it to your content. And then they can keep using it after the learning segment is over. It's not just that they've memorized it and matched it to a definition for that week. That's just renting it. But if they own it, that means they can tell you how this vocabulary works, how it can be used. They can demonstrate that to you. So think about how can you embed that into your lesson, and it may not be one of the lessons that you picked to do the full lesson plan with. It may be that you want to do it in a different day of your learning segment, and that's completely okay. But how could you embed working with vocabulary with your students so that they own that vocabulary? Now, that means really we can't have 20 plus vocabulary terms that your students are focused on. That's just not doable in a short time. And so really focus in on what are some key terms you want your students to be able to own at the end of your learning segment. So here's where it looks like on the template and where you're going to put that in. And now let's look at what you need to put. So you might jot down a couple of notes for yourself. You want to list in that little box, I'm talking about this box right here under vocabulary, you're going to list 3 to 5 key vocabulary terms that you really want your students to be successful with. These are connected to your content, of course. And then give a description of what strategy you're going to use to help them own the vocabulary. So, how are you going to work with them with the vocabulary? That's your strategy. And you can plan to use this strategy in all your lessons or just one. That's completely your choice. Just make it clear when you fill that section in of the box where this is happening. Is it every day? Is it only on a certain day in the learning segment, or maybe the first 2 days? Whatever the case is, just make that clear. And then, how is this strategy, how is it working? How is it connected to your learning segment? How is it working to help them understand their content better? That's the best part of it. How are they owning it with this strategy? How can you defend that they're not going to just forget it at the end of the week? Remember, vocabulary can also include symbols. So that's completely okay if you have symbols. It also can be phrases, short phrases as well. So it doesn't just have to be a single term. It can be phrases and it can be symbols as well. That's completely okay. So pull together 3 to 5 key vocabulary terms that you think would be important before we conference, and then think about a great strategy that you could implement, and it doesn't have to be lengthy, with your students in your learning segment. And then we'll talk about that at the conference and talk through how you think that applies to your learning segment. Now, the next 2 terms go hand in hand. The first one we're going to talk about is syntax. The other one is discourse. These may be particularly new to you, and using them in your lesson plans. And so if you have questions about this, that's okay. I want to give you a little brief introduction, of course, with this video, but then when we come back together and we conference, then we'll be able to talk through specifics that apply to your lesson plan so that you understand exactly how this is working. So think of syntax as an organizational structure. So how are we going to organize these symbols, these phrases, these words in order to make some meaning? So discourse, we're going to come to that in just a minute. Discourse is about how are we conveying the meaning, and syntax is how we are organizing it. So think about what that looks like for your content area. It may be that it's organized into a chart or a table in order to express the content, the meaning. It may be that in some games, we use X's and O's, we use symbols in order to convey certain meanings. It may be chord progressions. It might be that you are organizing persuasive argument by saying you need a claim and you need supports for that claim, and so on. So, how are you organizing what goes into making meaning of your content? So this can be how we organize symbols or words or phrases, and we're organizing them into structures where we can understand them. How do they make meaning, and how do you help your students organize these different symbols, words, and phrases to make meaning? So here is where you're going to insert your description of how syntax is working in your lesson. And this is going to give you an idea of how to make sure you can get your full points with syntax. And if you're a little fuzzy on syntax, that's completely okay. That's 100% okay. Just begin to think about, how do I want my students to organize their thoughts in my lesson and convey some meaning to me in my content, and get kind of a basic idea of that. And then when we conference, we're going to break that down, and we're going to find that syntax that's in your lesson. If it's not there already, and it may be, then we'll talk through how you can embed it. But if it's there already, we're going to capitalize on that. Now, syntax can happen in just one lesson, or it can happen over more than one day. Either way is completely fine. And syntax brings us to discourse. And discourse is, how we are going to talk or write and participate in constructing knowledge about our particular content. So remember, it's about your particular content. It's going to look a little different between content areas, and we're using written and oral language to convey it. Now, this is where you're going to, on your chart, talk about discourse. And I want you to think of discourse as, what's the message? What's the meaning that you want your students to convey? Maybe by the end of a particular lesson, maybe by the end of the learning segment. That's fine too. So think about what you think that looks like for your lesson when you come to our conference. And again, it can happen in all of your lessons, in more than one lesson, or just one lesson of your learning segment. Any of those options is completely okay. So now that brings us to, what are you going to turn in for Module 3 major assignment? And you'll see in front of you on the screen the template. So if you go to the assignment on D2L, you can download this template and you can just type right into it. You do want to fill out everything on the template. Don't delete some things because you don't think they're important. It's all important. And all areas of this template are connected to the grading rubric. So check that grading rubric. Be sure you're doing that as well. So when you go to upload your Module 3 major assignment, you're only uploading this template right here. You don't have to upload your learning segment that you worked on in Module 1 and Module 2. Now, if you want to go ahead and take those boxes about academic language and ELL strategies, those are on your learning segment, your lesson plan template. So if you want to go ahead and put those on there, it's perfectly fine, so that you have that before we go into Module 4 all in one place. But all you have to turn in to me for the Module 3 major assignment is this template. So we've talked about that top box of academic language and what you can put there. You also will need to fill in 1 to 2 strategies of how you're going to support your language learners. And this can be on one particular lesson day. It can be throughout your learning segment. That's completely up to you. And at the bottom, you're going to see a little clip from that section of the grading rubric of how that part of the chart will be graded. So you have a link of strategies that you can use on D2L. So go explore those strategies and then pick what you think would match well with your content and your learning segment. Then the other part of your template is a list of discussion questions. And you see the red arrows pointing to where those start. And you have 5 of them, and they are connected to the academic language and the ELL strategies that you listed and explained above. So you will also have, as part of the grading rubric, of how those discussion questions are going to be scored. And if you notice on there, it even tells you how many words you need to have in your paragraph. So it really kind of narrows down exactly what you need to have in those paragraphs. So you might want to give that a look before you turn it in or while you're working on it. So again, what do you turn in? Well, you're turning in just this one template document, and you will need to go back and look at your learning segment, your lesson plan, to get your ideas and to make connections, but you don't have to turn that in. You just are turning in this template. And so I would suggest you start looking over the template, start brainstorming some ideas before we conference. And then when we conference, let's break down and see what does academic language look like in your learning segment, because it's going to look a little different in everybody's learning segment and everybody's content area. And then we're going to start to kind of talk through the discussion questions down below. So take a few minutes to look through those discussion questions and maybe think about them before we conference, so that you'll have some time to ask some good questions, and we can make some headway of getting you some ideas down on paper by the time you end that conference. So that covers, very briefly, very quickly, academic language. Remember, it's an umbrella. It covers those 4 terms. And go back, re-listen to those sections, and think about what you might want to do for each one: function, vocabulary, syntax, discourse. If you don't have a perfect idea, or if you've kind of hit a wall and you just can't quite get there, that's okay. Just be thinking about it. Then when we get to the conference, we're going to talk through it. Just like how your students need to talk through their content and they need to talk about what they're learning to know it better, you also need to have someone to talk through your lesson planning with and your lesson planning thinking with, so that it is better as well. So I look forward to conferencing with you. Look through, think about your learning segment, and we will talk about it when we conference.